Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championships 2024 being held in Astana, Kazakhstan. You guys may have noticed I chose to tone down the intro for the first time in probably 2 years or something like that, but I feel like trying to do something different. Obviously, with YouTube videos, you want to be creative from time to time. All right, so the game we're going to be looking at is from the 4th round of this FIDE event, which happened yesterday. I did want to cover the game, but unfortunately I had some streaming obligations, wasn't able to get to it. So this game that we're starting with is between Magnus, Carlsen, and Rapport in round 4, the final game from the first day of this rapid event. All right, Magnus with the white pieces, 5-time world champion, playing against Rapport, a very, very strong player who represents Hungary. So the game starts with the move e4. We get the move c6, d4, d5, and Magnus decides to play the exchange variation with takes and bishop d3. Now, this is the system that I played for my entire childhood up until I was around 2400 strength, which is white wants to play for a very simple, free-flowing plan. You want to put the bishop on d3 to target both the diagonals. You want to play c3 here to create the classic pawn chain, and additionally, potentially play moves like knight f3, castles, and rook e1 later on. So Rapport goes knight f6. We get the move h3 here. Now this is a little bit of the new age approach. When I was growing up, almost everybody exclusively played c3, but I believe that these days after c3, bishop g4, queen b3, I believe queen c8, knight d2, knight c6, knight f3, and e6, black is considered to be doing completely fine. So Magnus plays h3, which stops bishop g4. Additionally, white might want to go bishop f4 or knight to f3 later on, but it's a quiet move, which means that now if black doesn't have either of these squares available for the b, and say you play a move like e6, suddenly the bishop is locked in behind the pawn chain. So we get the move knight c6. Magnus plays c3. We get to move e5 here from Richie. Very, very aggressive approach, and this is one of the reasons that back when I was growing up, usually people played c3 specifically because if black brought the knight out right away, you could immediately play bishop f4, preventing black from ever going for e5. So we get e5. Magnus trades on e5. He goes queen e2. We get to move knight to e4. Another very enterprising move from Rapport. And now we get the move bishop b5, check being played. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, can't Magnus just take the horse on e4? White can take, but after pawn takes and queen takes, let's just say you go bishop d6 here. You're probably thinking, wait, f4, you win the knight. Game over. GG, why not? But after f4, black has moved queen to h4, checking the king here. If you move the king to f1, black can simply castle. Can't take the knight because the queen will hang, and black's massively rapid development here to the center of the board combined with white having 1 2 3 4 5 6 pieces on their original squares means that black is winning. So Magnus goes bishop b5. We get bishop d7. We have the move knight to f3. Now we get knight g6. If black were to trade on f3, you would actually lose the game because after pawn takes knight, the knight is pinned here. You trade the b's, it's spaghetti time. King is in check, and you still lose the horse. You block, takes. White has an extra horse, and GG. So after knight f3, Rapport plays the move knight g6. Magnus plays the move bishop e3 here, trying to develop his knight and rook very quickly to the center of the board where you can try to put some pressure on this pawn on d5. Rapport goes bishop d6. Magnus plays knight bd2, and now we get castles. So far, pretty standard here, but now Magnus decides to trade the bishops and go for this move rook d1. Now, this is very, very greedy by Magnus. Granted, it is a rapid game, so you can't be too critical, but Magnus is actually worried that if he were to castle here, the Rapport is going to play something like rook e8, followed by f5, and they're going to be very serious threats here towards the king side, and white could be in trouble. Computer, of course, laughs and says, well, just go queen d3, pressure the pawn on d5, and let's just say black were to play a move like h6 here. This is actually a computer move, but it also makes sense to move the king. If you go f5, for example, you hang a pawn on d5. So let's say you play h6. White can now play rook a d1 here, followed by knight to b3, getting a lot of pressure on the pawn on d5. Magnus instead decides to play rook d1 here. He's trying to be greedy and delay castles while pressuring the pawn on d5, but now Rapport plays move rook f e8. Now this is not the actual best move. Computer prefers rook a e8, but nonetheless this is a human game, and rook e8 also makes a lot of sense to develop the rook to the open file. Magnus decides to trade the knights. We get the move rook takes e4, and here Magnus plays the move knight g5. Now this is a serious mistake from Magnus, and it's not obvious why it's a mistake right off, and I would say frankly it's a human move because the computer wants white to castle, but Magnus no doubt saw knight to f4 here. You can't capture, you lose the queen. And when you move the queen to d2, you probably saw knight takes h3, and it's like, uh-oh, if I take the horse after takes, there's suddenly all kinds of mates. There's the rook lift to g4, like takes and rook g4, checkmate GG. If you go knight to actually there's no knight move that stops the mate. I was gonna say knight g5, but even on top of rook g4, there's also queen h2 as well with a double A battery. So white's king is getting checkmated very, very quickly. I mean, I guess computer says you can go bishop f4, takes and play on, but that belabors the fact that you will lose the game. So what the computer likes here after knight h3 is it thinks you can go king h1 very quietly, and now after knight to f4, white can simply take, and after takes and queen d5 here, black doesn't really have any way to checkmate on the king side, and if queens come off in the center of the board here, white should never be worse. Instead, Magnus goes knight g5, and now Richie seizes the initiative. I think it's called carpe diem, like live the day or seize the moment, and he plays the move knight to f4. Magnus goes queen f3, and now we get the brilliancy of the game. Queen to b5 here, playing by Rapport. He is sacking the rook on e4 here, but he is stopping white from castling the king, and there are all kinds of threats with checkmate on e2. Now this is a great move here, and Magnus decides to play the move g3. Really the only move, by the way. If you take the rook after pawn takes, if you take, it's checkmate instantly. If you go queen g4 here, for example, I'm not sure which one is best. I think both are playable, but let's just say h5 here. And if you can never move the queen away here because of this checkmate on e2, it means you probably have to sack the queen, and this endgame should be winning for black because white only has a rook and a bishop in return for the queen. So Magnus goes g3 here, trying to kick the knight away from f4, and now Rapport plays move f6. Another great decision here, and Magnus takes the knight on f4. Now Magnus, obviously, as you can tell from the time, he's just completely stunned here by all these moves here. He spends 4 minutes on knight g5. Richie is blitzing out these moves, and now he decides to take on f4. Again, if Magnus were to take on e4, it's the same problem. After pawn takes knight here, let's just say you flick in a4. I can play, I think queen a6 or queen b2 are both fine. Queen a6 is actually queen a6 is not fine because there's rook d6. So I guess you take on b2. And again, this mate is simply unstoppable. Queen g4 here, and now you can play h5. No check on e6. Knight guards the pawn, and there's always this nasty mate threat on e2. So Magnus decides to take the knight. Richie takes the knight on g5. We get pawn takes pawn, and now we have the move rook f8. Great moves from Rapport here. As you'll notice, white is temporarily up a pawn, but the king is stuck in the middle of the board. You cannot castle through the check. Black has rooks on the 2 open files here, and when you combine this open king in the middle being unable to find safety, this is probably very, very scary. Now we do know Magnus has survived many bad positions throughout his career. He seems to be like Houdini at times. If he can get to an endgame, he just might survive. So we get the move queen g2 here, which is definitely a little bit surprising to me. I thought queen e2 felt a little bit more human here, but I guess this also loses immediately to rook takes e3, because after takes there's rook e8, which wins the queen, and after f takes e3 there's a beautiful bishop g3 check, king d2, and rook to f2, winning the queen this way. So Magnus goes queen g2, and Rapport plays rook f e8 here, intending to sack the rook on e3 once again. Magnus goes queen to f1, and now we get the move queen takes b2, and here Magnus plays the move rook to d2 and chooses to resign before waiting for the reply from Rapport. Now the reason Magnus resigned here is he probably saw that Richie can sack the rook, and after pawn takes rook, rook takes pawn here. If white goes king d1, there's queen to b1, checkmating the king. If you go rook to e2, black can simply play this move. Which one's quickest? Let's see. There should be a mate. There's bishop g3 or queen c1. I think you go check here, check, and then rook d3, which checkmates the king instantly on d2. And if you play king to f2, which is the one last try, there's takes, king g1, rook g3, checking the king, block, and queen g2 checkmate. So that is why after rook to d2, Magnus resigns before he lets Richie complete the meme dream and sack the rook on e3 for the bishop. But nonetheless, a fantastic attacking game from Richard Rapport in this situation. He plays a great game from start to finish. Magnus gets careless with one move, playing knight to g5, and Richie seizes the initiative immediately, plays knight f4, sacks the rooks, and wins a fantastic game. I have to say that looking at a lot of Rapport's games over the years, I know it's only rapid, but this game really epitomizes the style that Rapport has, where he can be very, very creative and very dangerous, very aggressive, and it's just really showcases how good of a player he can be, in spite of some of the situations where he has struggled at times. So Rapport gets a win in this big game, and what this meant, since this is a team event, it's the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championship, is that Magnus's team, the WR team, they actually lost this match to this team called Chessy, meaning that they are not clearly leading the event anymore. Now, when you think about this team WR, we haven't spoken about the team overall. You have Magnus, you have Nepo, you have Hu Yifan. You have at least one other really, really strong player on that team. I forget who it is right off, but it's supposed to be the big favorite in the event, and they are not leading after this shocking defeat. All right, So now the next game we're going to be looking at is a game played from this morning. Now this is a game from the 5th round of the same event. Magnus playing with the white piece against Daniil Dubov. Now this World Rapid and Blitz Team Championship has a lot of top players competing. I will take a slight station break just to talk for a second with you guys. Some people might be wondering, I think in the comments and so forth, why am I not playing? The main reason that I'm not playing this tournament is I did not get an invitation until very late in the I should say until right before the event was going to start, probably around Canada's time, April, Mayish. The offer wasn't great, and frankly, traveling all the way across the world to Kazakhstan from the US for an event that really has no bearing on ratings or qualification for the candidates and or the World Championship cycle really simply did not make a lot of sense to me, when I can do recaps for you guys from home, from the comforts of my home, and you guys can enjoy it yourselves. So, all right, back to the game. So here we go. Second game we're look at is Magnus with white piece against Daniil Dubov. Now Daniil Dubov representing Russia, very strong player. He is a former winner of the World Rapid Championship, someone who hasn't been playing a lot. I think probably the geopolitical situation has something to do with it, but also a player who is extremely dangerous. So after that loss, Magnus surely wants to come back fresh and show who the boss is. So we get the move e4. Dubov plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now Magnus plays bishop b5. And once again, we are in the classic Spanish. Those of you guys who watch a lot of videos, one question you might have is, why does everybody play the same opening all the time? You'll probably notice, I would say 90% of top all the games which have e4, e5 involve either the Spanish or the Gucci piano with this move bishop c4, and it's simply because the opening theory is so worked out that these are really the main tries where you can try to get a game and win. Scotch opening is possible too, but in general it's not considered as strong. So we get bishop b5, Dubov goes a6, bishop a4, we get knight f6, Magnus plays d3 here. This is the closed Spanish. He plays d3 immediately to prevent black from potentially playing the classic open Spanish with this line knight e4, d4, b5, bishop b3, and the move d5. So we get d3, Dubov plays b5, bishop b3, we got bishop c5, c3, d6, castles, rook b8, and now we have the move knight b d2 being played. Here Dubov castles, we get to move rook to e1, and now we have knight e7. Now another thing that I was starting to go off on a little bit of tangent on is you'll notice that this is the Spanish opening, but it's actually very, very similar to the Gucci piano. Really the only difference here is that white retreated the bishop went to b5 to a4 to b3, whereas normally in the Gucci pianos you get very, very similar situations. Just to illustrate the point, you can actually basically end up with the same position here already, where you get the same structure and the knights and the bishops are very similarly placed on the opposing diagonals. All right, so back to the game. We get castles, rook e1, knight e7 played. Now we get knight to f1, knight g6, and we have this move h3 being played. We got to move bishop b6, and now Magnus plays a4. Here we get to move h6, Magnus plays a5, and this is a very committal decision from Magnus. It's one of these situations where it's not always clear what you want to do. On the one hand, taking makes a lot of sense because you open the file for the rook. Really, the general idea for the rook placement here is if you trade, you play on the a file. Otherwise, when Magnus goes a5, what you're probably going to try to do down the road, just to illustrate, I'm just going to waste a bunch of time here, make some random moves, is you're probably at some point going to want to get this rook to the d1 square and then play for d4 in the center of the board. So it's always a tricky situation whether you want to trade and open up the lane or whether you want to try to bring the rook to the center to support the pawn thrust. So Magnus plays a5, we got bishop a7. Now we have the move d4 being played. Dubov goes c5, and we get the move knight g3. Another thing you'll notice in a lot of these Italians and Spanish is both sides usually put these knights on these two squares, and the main reason is to guard the pawns, but then also these knights on f3 and f6 generally support the pawn thrust. They almost always support when either side tries to push the pawn, which is why you'll see these knights on these squares or corresponding squares in almost every, not every, but I would say probably in like 80% of games, top level games in the Spanish or the Italian. So we get the move c4, bishop c2, Dubov plays b4 here, and now we get to move rook to a4. Dubov goes b3, we get to move bishop b1, and now Magnus is in a situation where the bishop on b1 is actually stuck. It has no squares available. These pawns basically cover all the critical squares in this position, and the bishop has no scope with the pawn in the way. On the other hand, these pawns can become very weak here as white is targeting it with the rook and or knight d2 and or queen c2. So if black can hang on to the pawn on c4, black will probably win the game, but if black cannot hang on to the pawns, white will probably win. So here we get the move queen c7 being played. Now this I think also illustrates how difficult chess is, because the computer wants to move bishop e6, which in a rapid game I would never even consider, because I would see d5, losing the pawn on c4, and I'd be like, okay, that's it, nothing more to do. But after bishop takes h3, g takes h3, and queen d7, Suddenly you hit the rook on a4, you're taking the pawn on h3, let's say takes, and suddenly there are all kinds of threats on the diagonal. You have these knights which are jumping to harass the white king immediately, and white is actually in a lot of trouble. Now in a classical game, I do think it's possible to spot this, but in a blitz game, blitz or wrap game, I think close to zero unless you know the idea already. So we get the move queen c7, Magnus goes queen e2, we get bishop e6, and now we have the move d5 being played, and here Dubov goes bishop d7 once again. This does happen, but it's one move too late, because now if you go bishop takes h3 after takes and queen d7, rook c4 and queen h3, you'll notice the queen is on e2 here. So when white goes knight to f5 in this position, the pawn on f2 is not as loose as it would be before. Let's just say knight g4. I think bishop to e3 here is fine, and white is probably defending, because after takes you have the move queen g2 on the next turn, and white should be winning. I guess the computer gives black some way to stay in the game with something like rook b5 or something really dank. Again, I think this is borderline impossible. This 3500 level chess, this would never happen in a human game. And then just to illustrate the difference here, by the way, after queen to h3, if you go knight f5, now on knight g4, the pawn on f2 is very weak. And if you go bishop e3 here, now black can play knight to f4, threatening to checkmate on g2. And if you take the knight, bishop takes f2 is instantly checkmate. So, and then just to illustrate it one more time, and here if black goes knight f4 after takes, bishop takes f2, it's not checkmate. After takes ef4 and rook g1. White actually has 2 knights and a bishop in return for the queen, 3 pieces for the queen. That usually should be adequate. And actually the knight on f3 also stops black from ever checking the white king. So back to the game, we get bishop d7, Magnus plays rook takes c4, we get queen a5, and now we have the move knight to f5. Dubov takes knight, we get pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight to f4 is played, and here bishop takes knight and pawn takes occurs. At this point, a lot has simplified here. We're in a situation now where both sides have these B's on these weird diagonals. On first glance, you'll think the bishop on a7 is much stronger than the bishop on b1, which is on a closed diagonal. However, black has some loose pawns here on d6, a6, and f4. So Magnus goes rook f1, we get rook e8, queen to d2, Dubov plays queen takes pawn, and this is probably not the best move here. I understand Dubov wanting to go into an endgame. Computer actually likes knight takes more, and I think after f6, knight f6, rook takes f4, and queen d8, black should be slightly better. Probably Dubov thought after knight d4, even though black has one extra pawn on the board here on a6, white has a great knight here, the bishop has some scope, and it feels like white is starting to take over the initiative. Computer just laughs, says rook b6, nobody cares. Black is better because of the extra pawn, but in human practice, I think it's very hard to play like this. So Dubov goes queen d5, and now Magnus trades the queens, and after rook to d1, Magnus is in his element. He's feeling good here. This is an end game. He can bring the bishop out. These pawns on d6 and f4 are weak, and now it feels like it's going to require precise play from Dubov to not lose to the greatest endgame player of all time. So Dubov goes rook to e2, we get rook takes knight, we get bishop takes pawn, king h1, we get rook takes b2, and now we have the move rook d1 being played. Here Dubov plays move bishop e3, which is slightly imprecise. Computer prefers a5 to try and start pushing p up the queen side, but bishop e3 also makes a lot of sense. You guard the pawn at f4, you create the wooden shield, and you still have plenty of time to go a5 a4 down the road. Magnus plays rook c6, we get the move a5, rook takes d6, get the move rook c2, and this is the fatal error. Computer wants a4, rook a6, and now rook to c2, because if white takes the pawn on a4 here, after rook takes c3, black is going to push b2, followed by rook to c1, and white actually is still slightly worse. I think computer wants something weird like knight g1, b2, knight e2, and like rook c5, and eventually there's always going to be a rook c1 trick, and black has adequate compensation. Instead, Dubov plays the move rook c2 first, and now Magnus is able to play this move knight to e5, which I guess is a mistake. As you can tell, I haven't looked super close to this game ahead of time. Apparently, rook d8, takes, king to h7, f6, g6, and king h2 is winning, but even this is frankly quite deep, so we get to move knight e5 instead. Dubov plays rook to f8 here, not a4 by the way, because after a4, I think rook to d8 would lead to a4 checkmate after knight takes f7, with the idea of rook h8, or maybe I have it wrong. Oh no, actually, sorry, you can just take the rook and go knight d3 and stop the pawn. Sorry for the sloppy analysis, you guys. And after queen takes, c4, a3, c5, bishop b2, and rook a8, you stop the a pawn and you push the c pawn up the board and win the game. So after knight e5, we got to move rook to f8. Magnus goes c4 here, and now Dubov plays the move rook to e2. Now I'm trying to ignore the evaluation bar just swinging wildly and go through this like a human would. At this point, it really is unclear what's going on. Now Dubov plays rook e2, probably trying to push a4, a3, but now Magnus goes knight to f3, retreating the knight, because if black plays a4, you still have rook to a6, stopping the a pawn from going further up the board. So we get the move bishop c5, Magnus plays rook a6, we get bishop b4, and now a very, very important move, which is c5 being played here by Magnus, because now white has a pass pawn going up the board. The a pawn is stopped by the rook, and so this pass c pawn, combined with the fact that black can't really push these pawns anymore, means that black is going to be very, very resourceful to try and save the game. So we get rook c8, c6 played by Magnus, we get to move king to f8, and now we have to move king h2. Computer prefers f6 here for some reason. The reason Magnus probably didn't play it, by the way, is because he probably figured at some point there would be some rook e6 to go after the pawn on the c6 square. So we get king h2, rook e7 is played, Magnus goes rook d3, we get to move rook c7, and now Magnus goes knight to e5. Now this is masterful play by Magnus, going after his pawn on b3, because at this point, if this b3 pawn falls here, if black does not get these two pawns going up the board, in the long term, this extra horse will play a huge role. So we get rook c7, knight e5 played by Magnus, we have the move b2, we get rook to b6 being played, king e7, and now we have rook d7, which is really sort of the end of the game. Computer here, I think, says that after king e8, rook b3, and f6. I still feel like after knight d3, takes, knight b4, white should win this after rook b2. Hard to believe that white's not winning. Computer wants this, but I do believe this endgame must be winning. You just bring the king and just wait here, h5, h4. Take the pawn on f4, and you will win in short order. So it's really hopeless anyway, but we get to move king e7. Here Magnus plays rook d7 check. We get to move king f6 with knight g4, king g5, and now Magnus plays this move rook to b5. Computer once again is screaming for this f6 move here, because if black were to take, now there's rook to b5, checking the king. After king to h4, knight f6, we get this very unusual Arabian checkmate on the edge of the board, and white will win. Now it's worth noting, because Magnus actually eschewed this f6 pawn push or pawn sacrifice on many different moves in a row. So I don't know if that says that he wasn't super sharp tactically, or he just thought it wasn't necessary, but it is interesting to note that he did miss it on multiple opportunities. So you get rook b5, and here Dubov plays bishop to e1, and now we get to move f6 finally. Actually, here it's almost impossible not to play f6, I have to say, because of the check. Computer prefers f6 here, but I think after knight to f2 and knight e4, white still should be winning this game, and white should cleanly be winning this game in multiple ways. So we get bishop e1, f6 played by Magnus. Dubov goes king to h4. We get to move knight to e5. Another nice little nifty maneuver with the horse, because now if black plays, let's just say a4, there's knight to f3, which simply checkmates the king here. It has no squares available. So we get bishop g3, king g1 is played, Dubov goes g5, and now we get rook takes rook being played. Of course, if white goes knight f3 and king h5, it's still winning, but Magnus just trades the rooks, and now he plays the move rook b7. Another great move from Magnus here, just ignoring the pawn. He could obviously take b2 and win the game, but with black's bishop so completely off sides here, walled in by the pawn, and only scope on two diagonals, pawns are super slow, and of course they're not going anywhere. Even if you could get this position, the pawns are still blockaded by this light square b. The pawns are going nowhere here, and so therefore Magnus will win. We get rook c8. Here Magnus plays rook takes f7. We get to move a4. If Dubov were to go rook d8, for example, Magnus has many ways to win, but probably simplest is to just play rook d7, slam the door on the diagonal, and after rook to e8 here, knight f3, king h5, now f7, knight covers the e1 square, and after rook f8 and c7, the wide peoples are going up the board, and white will win. So we get a4 from Dubov. Magnus plays rook h7. We get the move g4, rook takes h6, king g5, and Dubov sportingly allows Magnus to play the move knight to f7, checkmating the black king and ending the game. King can't capture the rook, can't go back, and it can't go to f5 because of the bishop from b1, which covers the square. So a very nice game for Magnus. It was obviously quite messy in the middle part of it, but Magnus showed great understanding of why having an extra piece really does matter. He maneuvered this knight from f3 all over the board very magically. The knight was dancing for a large part of that end game. So very, very nice technique. Even if it wasn't 3500 level, it still felt very, very smooth for the most part from Magnus. And he shows again why, if you give up material, pieces like bishops and knights, if you can blockade some passed pawns, in the long run, the extra pieces will play a huge role. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the end of the first day and the second day of the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championship 2024. If you guys are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we will be back with another recap tomorrow to see if Magnus' team can recover and win. I actually forgot one last little note in case you're still watching this video, is even though Magnus beat Daniil Dubov in this game, his team, the WR team, they lost the match 4-2, so they've now lost 2 matches. They're 1.5 points out of first place, and they are going to need a miracle if they want to repeat as champions in this event. So hope you guys enjoyed that recap. I'll be back with another recap tomorrow after the third and final day of the rapid portion, and hope you guys have a great rest of your day and enjoy everything. See you soon. Bye.